What would you do if the family you married into decided you were beneath them? Not quietly, not behind your back, but with the kind of casual cruelty that turns every dinner into a test and every smile into a weapon. That's what happened to Elena the first time she stepped into her husband's parents' grand cold house. They had the kind of wealth that made people speak softer, as if the furniture was listening. Chandeliers glowed like frozen suns above a dining table long enough to seat a minor parliament. Elena, in her simple cream dress and borrowed heels, was a stark contrast to the lacquered elegance of the women who flanked her new mother-in-law. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and judgment. At first it was subtle. A too long pause before answering her. A quick glance between her sister-in-law and mother-in-law when Elena mentioned her job at the local library. Laughter that stopped just short of including her. You know that kind of silence, don't you? The one that says, "We've decided who you are, and it's not one of us." Her husband Daniel didn't notice or pretended not to. He was too busy telling his father about a new investment, the two men leaning toward each other like twin towers of ambition. Elena sat back swirling her wine, letting their voices blend into a low hum. She could feel it, though, that invisible measuring tape running up and down her life, marking her at not enough. The moment that night shifted from cold to cutting came over dessert. The matriarch, all pearls and perfumed authority, leaned across the table and said in a tone so sweet it stung, "Daniel has always been ambitious. I'm relieved he didn't let sentiment lead him astray. After all, marrying well is a matter of legacy." Then the pause, the faintest tilt of the head eyes flicking to Elena. A few polite laughs followed. Someone murmured, "Of course." It was the kind of comment dressed as tradition, but dripping with insult, the kind that tells you you've been labeled less. Elena's fork hovered in the air. Her cheeks burned, but her smile didn't falter. Not yet. Here's the thing about being underestimated. It carves something into you, a quiet promise, a file you keep in the back of your mind labeled "one day." You don't need to shout. You don't even need to answer. You just keep your seat at the table and let them think they've won. Over the months, the treatment hardened. If she brought a dish to family gatherings, someone would forget to put it out. If she shared an idea, it would be dismissed until one of them repeated it later as their own. Gifts she gave were exchanged or left unopened on sideboards. Her presence was tolerated, never embraced. But they didn't see the way Elena began to watch them, how she studied the way each one needed to be seen. The sister-in-law, who thrived on competition but wilted under genuine kindness. The father-in-law, whose bluster hid a desperate need for control. The mother-in-law, who fed on being the unchallenged center of the room. Elena learned their tells, their vulnerabilities, and she stored them away like pearls in a drawer waiting for the right string to thread them together. You might think she should have confronted them, shouted, demanded respect. But that's the beauty of quiet revenge. It doesn't break the surface until the exact right moment. And when it comes, it's not noise that shatters the room. It's silence. One night, as winter wrapped the city in frost, Daniel came home with news. An opportunity, he called it. His family was in trouble, not visibly, not to the world, but enough to threaten their precious legacy. A bad investment. Liquidation needed. Discretion required. Elena listened, fingers wrapped around her tea mug, and said only, "I see." In that moment, the file in the back of her mind, one day, slid open. Because she had been building something quietly in her own name, in her own way. Something they didn't even know existed. And soon she would make them eat every single word they'd ever served her with dessert on the side. The frost that week seemed to creep under every door in the city, but Elena felt only heat, the slow burn of timing, finally ripening. Daniel's family had no idea that while they'd been busy dismissing her as decorative, she had been building a portfolio of her own. Not the kind you brag about at cocktail parties, but the kind rooted in shrewd, relentless discipline. Years of modest living, small but strategic investments, and a knack for spotting value where others saw dust. She hadn't told Daniel everything, not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew the weight of his loyalty to his family. And if he'd known she was capable of standing on her own, maybe he'd have underestimated her too. People who've never been starved for approval can't imagine the hunger it creates or how it makes you feed yourself in secret. That night he sat across from her at their small kitchen table, head in his hands. explaining how a property development had collapsed, how the family's liquidity was tied up, how his father was too proud to go to outside investors. Elena listened the way a woman listens when she already knows her next move. "They'll recover," she said softly, her voice almost sympathetic. Almost. Daniel exhaled, half believing it, half drowning. They can't lose face." "If people knew, they won't," she interrupted gently, and in her tone there was something that made him look up. The next Sunday, when they arrived at his parents' home for the usual polished lip, icy cheek kisses, the tension was palpable. The grand chandelier light seemed sharper, colder. Daniel's father greeted him with a heavy hand on the shoulder, but barely acknowledged Elena. It was as if their rudeness had calcified into habit. You know the type, the ones so secure in their hierarchy they forget that ladders can be kicked out from under them. Dinner passed with forced conversation until coffee was served. That's when Elena set down her cup and leaned forward, her voice calm but deliberate. "I understand you're looking for a discreet investor," she said, letting her words drop into the silence like stones into still water. Every head turned. The matriarch's pearls gleamed as her chin lifted a fraction. "And what would you know about investments?" she asked, the condescension sharp enough to cut. Elena didn't flinch. She let the question hang the way a hunter lets prey circle closer before the strike. "I know enough," she replied, sliding a folder from her bag. Inside were statements, contracts, proofs of ownership, assets quietly accumulated, diversified, and growing for years. Numbers that could plug their financial wound without them ever needing to whisper a word to the outside world. Daniel's father reached for the folder, but his wife's eyes stayed locked on Elena's. That was the real battle, not money, but control. "And why," the older woman said slowly, "would you offer us this? Generosity?" Elena tilted her head, her smile polite but unreadable. "Because families help each other, even when one side forgets the other is family." Silence. The kind you could hear stretching between heartbeats. The sister-in-law shifted in her chair, glancing between her parents and Elena, sensing the shift in balance, but not yet believing it. Daniel looked stunned, torn between pride and confusion. "You'd invest?" His father finally asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier authority. "Yes," Elena said simply. "On terms we agree upon. Fair terms." Fair. That word was a dagger wrapped in silk. It told them she wasn't there to grovel, and she wasn't there to gift. She was there as an equal, or perhaps in that moment the only one at the table with actual power. You could see it in their eyes, the flicker of recognition that they had misjudged her, maybe permanently. The insult they'd worn so casually for years now sat like a stone in their throats, because nothing is harder to swallow than the truth that the person you dismissed could be the one to save you. The matriarch didn't thank her. Not yet. That would come later in ways so small you'd have to squint to see them. But she didn't look away. And in families like this, sometimes eye contact is the first surrender. Elena sipped her coffee again, as if nothing had shifted, as if she hadn't just redrawn the map of the room. But inside, she felt the click of a door unlocking. The file marked "One Day" was no longer a file. It was open in motion, unstoppable. And the most satisfying part, she hadn't raised her voice once. The deal was struck within a week, cloaked in the kind of secrecy Daniel's family prized. On paper, it looked clean, Elena's private investment company. Yes, her company would inject the funds to stabilize their flailing development project. In return, she would receive a significant equity stake and a guaranteed voice in major decisions. Behind closed doors, however, it was something far more delicious, a silent shift in the family's hierarchy, a rewriting of the unspoken rules. Daniel hadn't stopped asking her where all this had come from. At night, lying in bed, he would turn toward her in the half-dark and say, "Why didn't you tell me?" There was no anger in his voice, just bewilderment tinged with awe. She would run her fingers along the hem of the blanket and say, "Some things grow better in the dark." It wasn't a lie. She had learned long ago that roots need privacy before they break through the surface. When the paperwork was signed, Daniel's father shook her hand, a handshake that lasted a fraction too long, as if trying to read her through her grip. His palms were warm, but his pride was ice. The matriarch, however, managed only a thin-lipped nod. You could see her battling the dissonance the daughter-in-law she had painted as a fragile ornament was now a player holding part of her family's future. You'd think that would soften them. It didn't, not at first. Old habits die slow deaths. The comments at family dinners became less overt, but still edged, like knives dulled just enough to make you bleed slower. The sister-in-law made jokes about lucky guesses in investments. An uncle at a gathering murmured something about the new boss in town with a smirk. But here's the thing, when you've tasted power after being starved of dignity, you stop needing their approval. You stop flinching at their digs because you've already built something they can't unbuild. That's when your silence becomes the most dangerous sound in the room. Elena began attending the project's planning meetings. At first, the older executives assumed she was there to take notes or pour coffee. Then she started asking questions, sharp-informed, unavoidable questions. Ones that exposed oversights and hinted at her understanding of market trends they'd failed to see. The room began to shift. Slowly, begrudgingly, they stopped interrupting her mid-sentence. Daniel noticed the change before anyone else admitted it. One night after a meeting, he drove them home in silence, then finally said, "They're listening to you." She glanced out the window at the blur of city lights and replied, "That's because I'm speaking in a language they can't afford to ignore." It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about rewriting the narrative they had trapped her in. Every time she spoke with authority, every time she presented a report they couldn't dispute, she was dismantling the caricature they had drawn of her. Bit by bit, the shadow wife they'd dismissed was becoming a figure they had to reckon with. The real turning point came on a rainy Thursday during a boardroom standoff over a crucial zoning permit. A senior partner, one of Daniel's father's oldest allies, insisted on pushing forward with a risky, outdated plan. Elena waited until the murmurs settled, then laid out an alternative backed by fresh data, local political shifts, and a quietly secured agreement with a key council member. The room fell silent. Daniel's father, jaw tight, asked how she had managed to get the council member's ear. She smiled. Some things grow better in the dark. No one argued after that. The vote swung in her favor. And when they left the building, Daniel's father didn't walk ahead as he always had. He walked beside her. You ever notice how power changes the way people look at you? Not just in their eyes, but in the tilt of their heads, the hesitation before they speak, the way they start rehearsing their words before you answer. Elena saw it now in every interaction. The same mouths that once shaped her name into an afterthought were beginning to speak it with care. Still, she didn't gloat. Not openly. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It just exists undeniable, immovable, and for those who once doubted it, a little terrifying. And deep down, they all knew it. She was no longer the woman grateful to be at their table. She was the one who could choose whether they stayed at hers. By spring, the project was turning around. The numbers once bleeding red began to hum with cautious profit. Reports were cleaner, forecasts sharper, and somewhere in those pages the signature of E. Whitaker sat like a quiet watermark. No title, no flourish, just a name that had become impossible to ignore. The family didn't speak about the transformation directly. They never would, but you could see the acknowledgement in the small shifts, the matriarch's invitations arriving on thick cream stationery, instead of as afterthought texts, the sister-in-law's forced smile when introducing Elena to friends as our financial genius. It was respect, but begrudging reluctant. The kind they give only because they can't survive without it. Elena didn't need them to like her. In fact, she preferred they didn't. Distance made the game cleaner. She played her role in family gatherings with surgical precision, warm enough to appear gracious, distant enough to keep them guessing. She let them tell their stories first, let them feel the comfort of their own voices, before quietly slicing through the air with something sharper. The more they leaned toward her approval, the less she gave. One evening, during a dinner meant to celebrate the project's recovery, the matriarch rose for a toast. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she said, "We owe our success to family unity and hard work." Not a single glance toward Elena. Not a single mention of the silent investor who had been their lifeline. It was an omission designed to reframe history, to make the savior invisible again. And that was the moment Elena understood something critical. People like them would never willingly give her the credit she deserved. They would take the results, rewrite the origin story, and expect her to smile at the fiction. So she smiled. She let them think they'd succeeded in erasing her, because she had something bigger now: leverage, the kind of leverage that doesn't expire with gratitude. 2 weeks later, she called a private meeting with Daniel and his parents. The air was heavy with curiosity when they arrived at her office, a space none of them had seen before. Glass walls, city views, shelves lined with quiet symbols of her work, financial awards, sealed contracts, photos of her shaking hands with people who could change the course of markets. "Why are we here?" the father asked, his tone cautious, not commanding. Elena leaned forward. "Because it's time to renegotiate." The silence was immediate, not shocked, wary. Daniel's mother sat back, her pearls perfectly still against her collarbone. Daniel's brow furrowed. "Renegotiate what?" "My terms," she said plainly. "When I came in, you were desperate. I gave you discretion, stability, and capital. The project's thriving now, which means my position has grown." The father's jaw tightened. "We agreed on equity. We agreed on equity based on risk." Elena cut in, her voice low but unyielding. "The risk is gone. The value isn't. I'm increasing my stake, and I'll be taking an active decision-making role in all future developments tied to the family's portfolio." It wasn't a request. It was a shift in the gravitational pull of the room. Daniel's father looked at his son, searching for some kind of ally, but Daniel stayed silent, maybe out of loyalty, maybe out of recognition that all of it was the result of every slight, every dismissal they'd handed his wife. The matriarch's lips curled into something between a smile and a warning. "You've certainly evolved." Elena met her gaze without blinking. "No, I've always been this. You just didn't look closely enough." You could feel it then, the unspoken realization settling over them like dust. This was no longer their game. It was hers. Later, after they left, Daniel lingered in her office. "You've changed," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I've just stopped hiding." And maybe that's what power really is. Not something you take from others, but something you uncover in yourself when they try to bury it. Summer came, and with it a new rhythm. One where Elena's name was spoken in business circles that had never known she existed before. Developers, investors, and council members now sought her opinion, first often bypassing the family entirely. On paper, she was still an equal partner. In reality, she had become the pivot around which their fortunes turned. The change was subtle at family gatherings, but unmistakable. Conversations paused when she entered the room. People who once dismissed her as Daniel's pretty quiet wife now weighed their words, testing them in their mouths before releasing them. Even the matriarch, still adorned in her unshakable armor of pearls, had learned the art of measured politeness. But Elena noticed something else, something sweeter than their reluctant respect. They were afraid of her. Not in the crude, blustering way people fear a threat, but in the quiet way people fear someone who has seen the blueprint of their weaknesses. She could see it in the flickers of eye contact, in the way they sidestepped topics that once would have been used to jab at her. One night during an intimate family dinner, just her Daniel, his parents, and his sister, the sister-in-law, made a slip. Wine loosened, she laughed and said, "Well, at least you married up Daniel." The room went still. It wasn't the words Elena had heard worse. It was the way Daniel flinched, the way his mother's eyes darted toward her, and then away, the way his father cleared his throat, as if to erase the moment. For the first time, they weren't waiting for Elena to be humiliated. They were bracing for the cost of it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look angry. She simply set down her fork and said, "Yes, he did." No one laughed. That was the thing about control. It wasn't about forcing submission. It was about shifting the weather in a room without lifting a finger. And Elena had learned to control the forecast. Still, she didn't waste her energy on petty strikes. She was building something larger than revenge. She began expanding her portfolio into industries the family had never touched. Tech startups, sustainable energy media. Each move was strategic, each partnership deliberate. She didn't just want wealth. She wanted influence that didn't rely on them at all. And slowly she began pulling Daniel into her world. He attended her meetings, sat beside her during negotiations, listened to the way she maneuvered through resistance without breaking a sweat. At first, he seemed unsure this was not the woman he had introduced to his family years ago. But one afternoon, after a particularly brutal negotiation, in which she walked away with double her initial ask, he leaned in and said, "You scare me a little." She smiled. "Good, that means you understand." The real moment of reckoning came when an outside investor approached the family with a buyout offer for the development project. It was lucrative enough to tempt even the most stubborn among them. The father wanted to accept immediately, the sister-in-law was giddy at the thought of a windfall, and the mother was already planning how to announce it without making it seem like a surrender. Elena listened quietly, then said, "I'm not selling." The father's head snapped toward her. "It's not your choice alone. It is if I hold the majority stake," she said, her voice calm but immovable. And there it was, the truth they had all ignored until that moment. She wasn't just an investor anymore. She was the controlling partner. Somewhere along the way, while they were busy trying to diminish her, she had positioned herself as the one person whose consent they couldn't bypass. The vote didn't pass. The buyout died in the room that night. And as they filed out, the matriarch lingered by the door, her voice low enough for only Elena to hear. "You've made your point." Elena looked at her for a long moment, then said, "This was never about making a point. It was about making sure I never needed your approval again." The pearls caught the light as the older woman turned away, but there was no retort this time, just silence, the kind that comes when the final balance has shifted and there's no way to tip it back. Autumn painted the city in burnished gold, but inside Elena's world, the colors were sharper, clearer. The development project had moved from survival to dominance in the market, and her other ventures were blooming in parallel. For the first time, Daniel's family was speaking her name outside their home, not as gossip, but as currency. People in their circles began to say things like, "She has an eye for timing," and if she's involved, it's worth looking at." They thought she didn't hear these things, but word has a way of finding the people who once went without it. The matriarch, however, remained a fortress. She would invite Elena to charity galas and luncheons, always seating her close enough to be acknowledged, but never so central as to overshadow herself. But Elena didn't care about seating charts. She cared about the whispered introductions, the kind where a woman's name is murmured with weight. And she noticed now that her own was often paired with phrases like, "the one who saved them." At home, her relationship with Daniel had shifted. Not colder, but different. There were nights he would watch her across the room, as if trying to reconcile the woman he had married with the woman now fielding calls from CEOs and political advisors. Once, after a particularly tense family dinner, he asked, "Do you ever wish it had gone differently? That they'd just liked you from the start?" She considered the question. "If they'd liked me, I'd have stayed small. Comfort makes you forget your edge." The real test came when a new project emerged, one with the potential to eclipse the family's current portfolio entirely. A piece of waterfront property tangled in political red tape, whispered about in investment circles as impossible to secure. The father called a meeting declaring it our next big move. Elena sat through the pitch without a word. When he finished, she leaned back, hands folded in her lap. "I already have the rights." You could have heard the ice in their veins. The sister-in-law blinked rapidly, her painted lips parting in disbelief. The father's face darkened. The matriarch stayed unnervingly still. Daniel looked at her like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or swear. "I acquired them last month," Elena continued. "Through a separate entity. I knew the council vote was swinging, so I moved early. If you want in, we negotiate as partners, not as family." There it was again, that recalibration in their posture, the tilt of their heads, the slow, quiet acknowledgement that they were standing on ground she owned, not just figuratively, but literally. The matriarch broke the silence. "And if we don't come in," Elena smiled faintly, "then you'll watch me do it without you." She didn't need to raise her voice. Power spoken softly can still echo for years. By the end of the week, they had agreed to her terms, and they were her terms entirely. Majority stake, full creative control, and a public announcement naming her as lead developer. The first time her name would be printed above theirs. At the press conference, she stood before a sea of cameras, Daniel at her side. The family was behind them, close enough for the photographs, but far enough that no one could mistake who was at the center. Her speech was precise, measured, and entirely her own. No mention of the past, no trace of bitterness, just vision. Yet when the questions ended and the cameras lowered, the matriarch stepped forward, offering her hand. "You've done well," she said, her voice flat, but lacking its old sharpness. Elena took the hand, held it just long enough to make the moment unavoidable. "I've only just started." And in that instant, she realized something profound. The revenge had already burned itself out. She no longer needed to prove them wrong. She had outgrown the table they'd once guarded so fiercely. Now she was building her own. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises,